Hello, hi, what's up? It's me, Kiran, your favorite booktuber, and today I'm here to talk about my it just so happens to be March 1st, and I'm going to be talking about what I read in February. Before we even get there, I know you're all curious, like, what is that shirt? What is she wearing? I am reading, well, yes, you read that right. It does say Ottessa Moshfegh on my shirt. I got this shirt from Girl Parts, which is a really great shop that one of my friends runs. And if you happen to be literary inclined, hooked on phonics, whatever it may be, or you know someone that is, you might want to check out their shirts and sweatshirts because they're great and they're lovely, and I'm sure that you will love them. Okay, anyways, one of the first books that I read was Beautyland, which is right here. This is like a soft, subtle story about a young girl who is born in the Philly area, and she also happens to be an alien, and she is born to a human mother who basically is a single mother and who is raising her all on her own. And we're seeing this child grow up, so her early experience, we like see the moment of her birth, and then we see her in elementary school, her in high school, college, early adolescence, coming to age, and then moving to New York. It's very much so a cradle to coffin kind of story. We're covering all this like a huge span of time, and the author is someone who, because she's an alien, she happens to have a very different view of the world, and her otherness is a metaphor for her what can be read as like autism. She has a very unique view of the world, and while she is living her life, she is also sharing her thoughts and reflections on humans, how they move through the world, to her alien overlords. And the way that she's doing that is she's sending them faxes, and then they respond to her with their own thoughts and observations, but they're very like short. And so the book is very moving at times, the relationship between the mother and the daughter and their sometimes like inability to understand each other. And I would say that it's a very like cute book, but there's very low stakes, and at times you're kind of like, okay, where are we going? What's happening? Let's like move it along. And so I wish that there was like sometimes more tension or more things happening, or that we even had a more narrow focus, because I do think that we cover so much of her life that was a little dull at times. But it's a very like enjoyable read because the writing's very smooth and you just like run with it. You just can like get into the zone very quickly. Though I would have to say that we did get to a point where some of the observations that the narrator has about humans, I was kind of like, I don't know if I was like skimming those sometimes towards the end. And I think that if you're someone who maybe liked Patricia Lockwood's Why Is No One Talking About This? Is that the name of the book? No One Is Talking About This? You know the book I'm talking about, right? I think you might like this, but it's less quirky than that, but still has a kind of undercurrent that's cute. Then we switch gears. I read McNally's book, Rent Boy. This is very slim, and this is interesting. This is for fans of unreliable narrators. We have our main character, Danny, who is living in New York and is working at a restaurant situation, but also happens to be a rent boy and is also an architect student. So our main character, Danny, has a lot going on, and he is relaying his experiences in New York to a former friend slash lover, romantic interest, and the way he's doing that is through letters, and he's really setting the scene of New York. So when we first start, kind of like half the novel is really an exploration of the various clubs, cafes, downtown New York kind of vibes in the 80s. This is taking place in the 80s. I didn't realize that at first. So the main character, Danny's really like laying it on thick. You're getting a really good understanding of this landscape and some of the key players. And he is also really good friends with this guy named Chad. Chad is hot. And also someone who, I guess you could say, like how I'm gonna say it is like their prefrontal cortex isn't really developed fully, and so they're kind of someone who gets into trouble quite a bit, and he gets involved with some shady people and drags Danny along with him, and you're kind of just seeing this mess ensue. And at the same time though, the action really doesn't happen until the last 40 pages of the book, so you just have to go for a ride. But it is a very interesting book because the observations are really interesting, I would say, and it's very like unique. This is kind of like a thriller almost, and the evil of this book, like the evil bad guys, they're scary. I don't like them. And the way that this one woman is described, though, it would really fascinate me. I'm gonna give you like a brief snippet, but I would say you're gonna hear this and you're like, that's not that bad. That doesn't sound that interesting. But this lady is a villain. She's horrible. Okay, this is on page 61. By this time, Mavis was stoned and started laughing. She's kind of stunning when she laughs, but a little scary too. Like I said before, Mavis is a good time gal, very what you'd call giving. But underneath it, there's something hard and basically indifferent to people, and it shows in her faces. She's thinking all the time, Mavis. And what she's thinking is, what's in it for me? Believe me, you do what I do for a living, you recognize that look a mile off, which I'm not condemning or anything, it takes one to know one. Okay, then another one on page 101. Shut the fuck up, Mavis screams, still smiling her Queen of the Moon smile, and grabs his pants under the table and squeezes. Yeah, I'm not sure if I said this, but I would say this is for, if you happen to like Dennis Cooper's writing, you will definitely enjoy this. This is a book that's looking at sex, depravity, and the like New York's underbelly. So very intense and charged, but also because it's so short, you're able to manage it. After that, I did a book on audiobook, which was a nonfiction situation. This is The World According to Joan Didion by Evelyn McDonnell. And though this book is not a biography of Didion, it is a really great primer into the author and the various touch points and motifs that are important to her life and her writing and that run through both of them. And so each chapter is divided into these different touch points. You have a chapter on California, a chapter on, well, I think it was actually like Malibu. Then you have a chapter on gold, a chapter on snakes, because Joan Didion and her husband both feared snakes, and you can see the various ways that it pops up in her work, and I thought that was really interesting. You also learn about Didion in a way that is different than what you would get from the Wikipedia page. You know, Didion is someone who is, you know, an icon, the Celine campaign, her packing list, her various essays. Like, we know a lot about Didion, but at the same time, I think this author is able to pull out things that you wouldn't necessarily get on the Wikipedia page. You find out a lot about Didion's familial background from both the maternal line and the paternal line. And, you know, Didion was someone who comes from pioneers, and that's really interesting. You learn more about her various relationships. She had a steady boyfriend in college, and then she came to New York, and she had this very charged relationship with this one guy whose name is completely escaping me, and he was really mean. He called her a timid mouse at one point, and that's not nice. And we learned just like a lot about Didion, her marriage, and though she was someone who was not very, she wasn't a proponent of marriage, yet she still is a woman who has a marriage. And you just learn more about those nuances and see how it pops up in her work. And I would really recommend this book because the author is able to show, like, look at Didion with a very nuanced view. Like, it's not like she is a very big fan of Didion, but she still is able to point out her weak points when it comes to her ideas on feminism and like various other things. I would say this was a really great book, and it really primed me to read Run River by Joan Didion, which is Joan Didion's debut. And I would say that before that, there were moments where, obviously I have read Didion's nonfiction work, but her fiction work really overwhelmed me and scared me because sometimes I find her nonfiction, though very beautifully written, to not entirely engage me in the most ways, to not exactly always engage me. So I was feeling really hesitant to read this. However, The World According to Joan Didion made it so easy to read this because within the first chapter, we've already seen a lot of the touch points, you know, gold, California, snakes, driving, marriage, like that all pops up, and you're able to just enjoy this book. Really, I'm so happy. Like, sometimes you get this book, I've had this maybe for like 2 years, and I was so hesitant to read it, but you know, you just have to read the book when the time is right, and the time was right because I read The World According to Joan Didion, and very pleased, very happy with my reader life in that capacity. So we're going to talk about this, which was Joan Didion's debut, came out in 1963. This is a book all about California and marriage and sex. Okay? So we have our main character, Lily, who is a character that I guess you could say she would not say moo. She would not say boo to a goose or a moose. What I mean by that is that she's a character who is really shy, introverted, very neurotic, overthinker, prone to weeping, but also has this like reserve of strength and solitude that makes it such that when the pressure is on, she's able to perform and do something really unimaginable. But we're looking at her whole entire life and the people in her life. We start, it is a very hot summer, August 1959, and Lily heard the shot at 17 minutes to 1. That's the inciting incident, that is the action, and it is from there that we then get maybe like one more chapter about the situation, the lay of the land, and then we go back in time to 1939, I believe, when she is 1938 rather, when she is 16 years old, and we are just seeing her life over the next like 20-30 years. And Lily is a character. I made a whole entire like individual book review about this book because I really enjoyed it. So Lily is a character. So if you're like want to know more, go there. I'm trying to like think of unique ways to talk about the book that isn't verbatim what I said in that book. But Lily is a very sheltered young girl who is very content with California and her family's land and their understanding that they are the children of pioneers and this land is their land, it belongs to them. And she is someone who, though she goes to college, doesn't feel comfortable there. So when she comes back home, she is unsure of really what to do with herself. She could do anything in almost many regards, not exactly anything because this is what, like the 40s or whatever, but she's educated, but she doesn't know what to do with herself. And so she gets married to Everett, who is a man she has known her whole entire life, and they are both like Californians who love their land and won't leave it and are very content with their land and their lifestyle, but their lifestyle is going away because California is changing. You have characters like Ryder Channing who's coming through, and though he is a slick salesman and very shady, he is an example of the kind of people who are coming into California and trying to develop it, make real estate houses and do what it is that people do when it comes to trying to change a place and like, you know, inject money into the economy and really like shake it up. And you're just seeing these characters and their lives and the moral decay of their life. Like heat is a really big theme that runs through this book, and you know, when it's really hot out, you don't do a lot, and you kind of just see the way these characters are just overwhelmed by the heat, by their life, by the opportunities available to them. I think what's interesting about this book, which I didn't discuss in the previous one, is the undercurrent of fashion that runs through this book. And The World According to Joan Didion also touches upon how Didion has a very unique view of material objects because, you know, she did work at Vogue. She is really aware of her surroundings and the objects that she uses, and you kind of do also see that in this book because there are moments where things are happening and we get descriptions of what Lily is wearing that are just very, it's not like it's every single time, but those observations are just so like, they still stick with me. For example, after Lily goes to San Francisco for a certain reason, which I won't tell you guys, she comes back on the bus and she's wearing a white silk suit. And then her sister-in-law Martha at one point buys a dress that is very ostentatious, over the top, a gown that has butterflies on it, which also like is kind of important. Like it's just interesting to see how Didion is able to use these descriptions of clothes to reveal something about the character and what they're going through at the time. And to wrap this up, this is a book that's looking at, as I said before, it's looking at the disintegration of Lily's marriage, but also is kind of just a testament to their marriage because Lily and Everett do love each other, even though they both do things that are, as outsiders, we're like, it's kind of, that's wild, that's whack. So I do definitely recommend this book, but I would say it also at the same time, slightly boring. So just, you know, heads up if you go into it, because it's just, there are moments of, it's like, it's not an action-packed book. It's really a character study of Lily, Everett, Martha, and how they're living their lives, and just, you gotta go with it. Go with the flow, okay? Run River. In the aftermath of Run River, which is a book about marriage, I read another book about marriage, Binstead Stari by Rachel Ingalls. Now, I did really like this book, but I'm gonna have to say that after I read reviews about the book, I found out that Rachel Ingalls' more prominent, better known book is Mrs. Caliban. That is the one that everyone in the reviews was like, I read Mrs. Caliban first and then I read this, and Mrs. Caliban's so great. So just, you know, FYI. nonetheless, I did really like this. So this is a story of Millie and Stan, who just so happen to be New Englanders like me. And Millie is a housewife. She is married to Stan, who's an academic, and he's really grouchy and evil and horrible, and he's cheating on Millie left, right, and center. And he is an academic who's interested in like folklore and mythology, and he is going to Africa. We never find out which country it is. We don't even know what decade it is. And though this book came out in the 80s, I really feel like this is set in the 50s, 60s. And so they're going to, maybe the 60s. And so they're going to Africa, and we never find out what country it is, but we just know that there was a revolution attempt that happened but failed. They're going to Africa, but before they get that, they're going to spend a week in London. And while they're there, Stan ignores Millie completely and is just out with his friend. I think his name's Jack, and they're just gallivanting throughout the town, doing drugs, having sex, being wild and free. And he's just like, oh, I'm so happy I'm not with Millie. And then Millie is, in the first like 2 days, she's kind of upset that they're alone, and she is walking the streets of London, and she happens across an image of herself in a window, and she is shocked at the reflection of herself. She is looking at herself, and she's like, who is this woman? Is this what I really look like? And in that moment of reckoning, she switches up. She has a major glow up. She gets a haircut, she buys 2 new pairs of shoes, and she gets a whole bunch of dresses, and she starts living life. She's going to the theater, plays, all the museums. She's seeing everything, and she is having this like metamorphosis, and Stan is obviously not seeing it because he's self-obsessed. And they get to Africa, and the change really has fully manifested, such that Millie is charismatic. Everyone loves her. And Stan is beginning to notice that something is up with Millie, that things have changed. And he's like, why does everyone like her? Why is she not a nervous wreck? Like, what's going on here? And though this book is told from a distant third, we get moments of glimpses and thoughts from Millie and thoughts from Stan, and we see the way that they are reflecting on each other. And we find out that Millie was basically at her wit's end because of Stan. He had completely belittled her such that she was like really depressed and like on the brink of a nervous breakdown, and her metamorphosis makes it such that she is now willing to leave the marriage. However, I don't want you to think this is entirely about marriage, because it is, but it's also not, because at the same time there's this undercurrent of magic kind of running through the book, but it's not exactly like magical realism kind of book. It's just very like lightly sprinkled throughout, and we don't even get a lot of information about it because we just don't. It's just like something that's there but really isn't explained, but also doesn't take a big hold of the book. And when Millie is in Africa in the very, very beginning, she also happens to stumble across Harry, and Harry is the love of her life. He is a Canadian expat living in Africa who has a very like charismatic, this is a hero. This is a guy from myth and legend who has come and just really changed the world, and they meet and they're just sparks, right? So you would think then, after that happens, that this is gonna be like a romance, that Millie and Harry are the be all end all. But Rachel Ingalls really like, she rips the rug from you, rips the rug from under you, and things switch up because that's not how this book goes. It's really interesting to see what the author does, because she is really playing with your expectations. Like in another author's hands, this would be a rom-com. And I do honestly think that this is a great groundwork for a romantic comedy film. Like, I see potential here, but that's not how Ingalls handles it. She is looking at Millie and Stan as kind of two different ends of the spectrum. They are two people whose views on life and art are diametrically opposed from each other, and we learn more about that. And we're also seeing what this book shows us is the various ways that marriage strangles women. We hear about Millie's mother's marriage, Millie's sister's marriage. There is another character in the book named Jill who is also experiencing a nervous breakdown, and we're hearing about that. And just the book is very layered, even though it's so short. And I was really fascinated by the way that like Ingalls managed all of these different themes and storylines. Not even storylines, just like ideas. There's a lot happening in this, even though it's so slim and it's like very easy to read. I don't know if you guys can tell. I enjoyed this. I would recommend it. I'm gonna wrap this up because I'm talking so much about it because I'm just really impressed by like what went into this book. Though it's not perfect by any means. Like I still think we could have had more. I really wish that there was a happy end. I mean, there is kind of a fulfilling ending, but it's not what I wanted. However, I would say it's just a very interesting book about marriage and women's autonomy. Though if you want to lobby a complaint, it would be it is interesting to think that Millie's autonomy, she achieves it like momentarily, but she achieves autonomy but also doesn't, because her autonomy only comes through another partnership with a man, which is very interesting to think of it through that lens. So check this out. All right, after that, I read another poetry collection, another one that I did not buy, and I really wish that I did, but it's okay because I'm gonna get the full collection and those poems will be in there. Anyways, before we even get there, what is the name of the poem? High Windows by Philip Larkin. This was the poet's final published poetry collection. It's really slim. There's probably about like 30 poems in there. And it's really interesting because these are the poems that came towards the end of his life. And so the themes are kind of very much so focused on, you know, life, death, youth, vitality, and child rearing also comes up. There's one poem that is called This Be the Verse, which ends with, which is looking at how parents fuck you up. Like literally, that's the first line of the poem. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. And then the poem ends with this idea: get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. I thought this poetry collection was really phenomenal. Like, it's a great primer because the poems were about these like very heavy themes, but also like digestible and interesting. And I'm curious to read more of his work. And I would have to say, next up, we had a book that I did not love as much. We had In the Café of Lost Youth. This is a book that I really wanted to read because I loved the cover. So you gotta be careful out there. Covers can trick you. This is a very slim book that has 4 different narrators in each of the chapters. We have 3 guys who are all obsessed with Loki, who is the woman of this book, and she also gets her own chapter. It is the 3rd chapter in the book. And these characters are, the first one is this young academic who is hiding his identity. The second is a private detective who's also hiding his identity. Then we find out about Loki, whose real name is Jacqueline, and we get to know her backstory. She is the daughter of a single mother who they were both not very good at communicating with each other, but they have like a loving relationship, though just distant. And then you get the 4th chapter, which is a guy who knew Loki quite well and is kind of filling out the final details. Like, we get to know what ends up happening with Loki. And so thematically, the book is, these characters are really focused on youth and memories and how things change, and neutral zones comes up quite a bit for some reason, and it's very much so focused on Paris, the various streets, the neighborhoods, and it's very focused in that regards. But I would say that I just wanted more from the book, but it's not that. It's not something that's going to really like give us a full picture of Loki. I think it's very just broad strokes, and I was unimpressed. And I don't know, maybe in French it's better, and the translation may have not given it its full dues. But I just think that this feels more like a writing experiment versus an actual like novella. And I think what we've learned more about Loki, because she's the, you know, character who is charming all these people. They're fascinated by her, they're intrigued by her because she's so mysterious. And then we find out that Loki is someone who is interested in running away, and that's kind of what all these characters are doing, right? They're running away from who they really are. They kind of all adopt false identities because they're all hanging out in this one cafe in Paris where they can be whoever they want. And it's kind of like, it implies that this book is about the underbelly of Paris, but we don't really know what anyone's doing. It's all just very like smoke and mirrors. That's what I think. After that, I read another nonfiction book, Pure Wit, The Revolutionary Life of Margaret Cavendish, who is a woman who was a 17th century writer, thinker, philosopher who lived a very interesting and eccentric life. And in many regards, the like cult of personality around her, almost, I guess you could say, took more precedence, such that people while she was living, and then especially once she died, never took her seriously. And this book is really looking at her life and her writing, her work, there was a lot of it, and just giving us all the details and all the information. It was a really fascinating read, because though the book is about Margaret Cavendish, her life, we also are learning a lot about England, the culture, the society, so many things. This book has a lot, and I can't get into everything, but I'm gonna try to give you a good primer on who Margaret was and what's the situation. So Margaret was born in like, I don't know, 16 whatever. And she's born to a royalist family and was a child who was really shy, super shy, and very melancholic and incapable of talking to strangers or like people who weren't her family. And we find out a lot about the royalist cause, what's going on there, the kind of civil war in England, the various factions, and what made it such that Margaret ends up leaving her family, going to France, being in the court there, but also while she's there, she's so shy. She's unable to talk to people. She really doesn't know how to speak French. And while she's there, she ends up meeting William, who ends up being the love of her life. And though they get married and mostly have a very happy marriage, kind of, it's implied, Margaret was very anti-marriage, and there's just so much happening. So through her marriage, though, she is really lucky because William and his brother are just really understanding of who she is, and they help to like educate her, give her books. She's introduced to a lot of the leading intellectuals of Europe, and she's reading and writing voraciously and doing her own like intellectual work and publishing her own materials. And we're learning a lot about the people who were publishing at the time, and most of them weren't women, and if women were publishing, they would be publishing books about like kind of letters to their children sort of situations. Like women publishing was so unheard of. The fact that Margaret Cavendish was a woman who was from the aristocracy publishing materials with her own name was kind of revolutionary and was something that was frowned upon, and people thought it was whack. And then the author's also giving us a lot of information about this, the fact that publishing was considered a feminine act, and there's some really like vulgar language about how pressing as related to publishing also is another way, like slang for fucking, and just so much information in this book. Honestly, I would really, you got to check it out. And at the same time that's happening, we then have like other chapters which are looking into women's thoughts on child rearing and miscarriages, and there are letters and poetry from women in Margaret Cavendish's life who were experiencing these things, and the authors revealing their thoughts and how their various religious beliefs would then affect their thoughts on the miscarriages, and how, you know, there's this one woman who wrote something like, you know, I really wanted a child and we're so blessed, but God took the child away from us, and you know, it's because he is teaching us this. Like, it's just really moving writing when you really think about it, these experiences. And the author's also revealing what people thought about, like there's some like midwifery writing. There's so much going on. I just can't really get into all of it, and I definitely think you should check it out, even if you're not interested in this woman, because I like had no idea who Margaret was, but I'm so happy now that I know who she is, because she is an important woman writer who was, you know, leading the way, even though when Virginia Woolf is doing her thing, she completely rips Margaret Cavendish apart. And many people, many academics did not think very highly, and still probably don't, I think, but there's things that are happening that are making it such that that's changing. And one of the reasons for that is because Margaret Cavendish's writing is like very intense, flowery and convoluted almost. It's like really fascinating writing, though I haven't read it just yet, so maybe I should read it first. But that's the impression that I got, because some of the things were read. Margaret was writing about, like, she was writing poems, she was writing sonnets, but she was also doing a lot of philosophical writing and thoughts about atoms and dark matter and things like that. And though people would kind of, academics have in the past been like, her writing is whack, the author points out that Margaret was writing the same way that other academics were, like other leaders, thought leaders of the time were, and her writing actually isn't that much of an outlier. And then we're seeing her plays, because she also wrote plays, even though they were never acted out. And the author kind of talks about how her plays were really interesting because they are just very unusual. As for plays, they don't follow really standard play conventions, but they do really take an intense look at marriage. And there's this one play where the women basically have decided to make their own like home and mansion situation, and then a man comes and infiltrates it, and it's just, there was a lot happening in this book, and I am glad that I read it. And to kind of like conclude, because there are a few final thoughts about her that I want to touch upon, Margaret is someone who, though she was really shy, ends up coming into her own, and towards the end of her life is dressing really over the top in some really engaging, saucy outfits that are really fascinating and made her the talk of the town. And sometimes just the way that she was able to craft a life of her own is really interesting. Towards the end of the book, we find out more about like property rights and how she was managing that, and just so much happening in this book. Definitely check it out. Now we're going to talk about the fantasy books that I read, because I read 4 different fantasy books. One of the first ones that I read, that I'm going to talk about as 2, because that's just how I look at them in my brain. I read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, and then I read the second book, Iron Flame. Okay. Yeah, I went there. I read these books, and I kind of have to issue a public apology, because I was really like, I'm not going to read these books, like, whatever, who cares, blah, 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 but I take it back. I'm sorry. Like, I shouldn't have been running my mouth like that. These books were a lot of fun. This is a fantasy book about dragons, and our protagonist is this woman, this young girl named Violet. She's like 22 years old, and she is being forced to go to the Dragon Academy because her mother is making her, but what she really wanted to do, what she spent her whole life studying for, is, you know, being a scholar. That's what she wanted. So the way that this society is organized is that like your scholars, your dragon riders, there's a cavalry, or your like healers. And it's a very like stratified in that regards, like society. And it's so interesting because in some regards, I don't really like the way that this fantasy world is set up, because like I have no interest in this kind of hierarchy and like organization. Like that's not for me. So as you get that, she is in her first year, and you find out that, you know, there's kind of a conspiracy. There's secrets that are happening, and she gets involved with the bad guy, Xaven. And I loved it. I read the first book in a day, and then I was so just like with it, I went to the second book. And the second book is convoluted. It should have been split into 2 books. There was a lot happening in it, and yeah, I don't know. It was crazy, but I think it should have been split into 2, and we needed more room to breathe. And though the book, I think it has a lot of potential. Like, I think it could be better. I think it has a lot of potential. It's a really fascinating world, and there's so many moments that we could do greater world building and really like flesh things out, but that doesn't happen. We're really racing through this, and it's so fast, but because of just like, I don't know, there is something very like intoxicating and compelling and fascinating, and just you're eager to read more. But I just kind of wish it was slightly like fleshed out a bit more, and I don't know, it's fun. It's a wild ride, and I'm here for it. And though I have a fear that, because apparently the author does know how this book is going to end, it's going to be a 5-book series, she knows how it's going to end, I'm afraid that Xaden and Violet are going to die, and I don't like that. That's not what I want. I'm not happy. And so yeah, those books like gave me a lot of joy. I was really able to enjoy them. I should have done like a reading vlog to talk about them, because I don't know, yeah, I don't know, whatever. Okay, after that, then I read Bookshops and Bonedust. This is the prequel to Legends and Latte. And this is an interesting book because there are more stakes in this book than there were in Legends and Lattes. But at the same time, I was sometimes occasionally a little bit bored by Bookshops and Bonedust. But it's just like a chill story. Basically, we find out about the main character's name, whose name I've completely forgotten. We find out her backstory, like how it is that she got involved with the mercenary group that she's involved with. She was injured and stuck in this seaside town, and while she's there, she becomes friends with this woman who owns a bookshop, and they're trying to make the bookshop happen, but at the same time she's being there's a necromancer who's wreaking havoc into the world, and that's like a theme in the book. I don't know, it was just a fun read, but it wasn't my favorite. But I don't know, it's just interesting to think about that book in comparison to the first book where there was like no stakes, no tension, nothing happening. And this one had a bit more tension, which I did appreciate, but still wasn't like fully hooked. I don't know. That's that book. And then the final book that I read in the month of February was The Stolen Heir by Holly Black. Now this is a duology, but also in the Elfhame world. And this was a book that I had on my shelf since it came out and I've been really hesitant to read it, but I'm glad that I did because it was enjoyable. We are following Wren, who is a character we were introduced to in the Cruel Prince trilogy, and she was a child queen whose parents were abusing her basically, and we're finding out like the aftermath of what happened to her. In this book, she's now 19 years old. She's basically absconded from the Fae world and is living wild, like by herself, isolated, very alone, and somehow she gets swept into a quest by Oak, who is a royal prince, the heir, and they set off on an adventure, and they're kind of getting to know each other a bit more, and we're finding out more about Oak, that he comes across as really charismatic, but actually is competent, but he never lets people think that about him. And Wren is someone who is very like sad girl vibes, but not in an annoying way. Like she's really observant and quiet and shy and just interesting. I really liked her as a main character. And then we get to the end of the book and, well, cliffhanger, because some characters go bad. They go really bad. And I'm excited to read the second book, which comes out, I believe, Tuesday, March 3rd, 5th. I don't know what day Tuesday happens to fall on this week. Whatever. Anyways, it's coming out on Tuesday because that's when the books come out. But yeah, those are the books that I read in February. I would love to know how your reading went. If you have any great reads, let me know in the comments. If you've read any of these books and you have any thoughts, let me know. I would love to hear them. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Thank you.